Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, and we begin with the sky-high tension between the U.S. and Iran as both countries ramp up their military threats and saber-rattling, even as diplomatic discussions are underway to rein in Tehran's nuclear program. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are in Geneva today for the second round of indirect negotiations with Iran. Ahead of today's talks, while speaking to reporters on Air Force One last night, President Trump said he believes that Iran wants to make a deal.
So I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important, and we'll see what can happen. I mean, it's been typically, Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators, or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators, because we could have had a deal instead of sending the B-2s in to knock out their nuclear potential, and we had to send the B-2s. I hope they're going to be more reasonable. They want to make a deal.
Have you been told that a deal is next to impossible?
No, I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal. They want to make a deal.
Those comments come just days after President Trump said this about possible regime change in Iran.
Do you want regime change in Iran?
Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk.
Now, following today's talks, a U.S. official telling NBC News that progress was made, but there are still a lot of details to discuss. While Iran's foreign minister telling state media that the two sides, quote, agreed on some general guiding principles, but looming over the negotiations in Geneva, escalating military threats from both countries. The U.S. continuing its military buildup in the region. President Trump repeatedly touting what he calls the massive armada the Pentagon is sending to the region, with one U.S. aircraft carrier already there and a second on its way. And this morning, Iran's supreme leader issuing a threat of his own, posting on social media, quote, more dangerous than that warship is the weapon that can send that warship to the bottom of the sea. Meanwhile, Iran is also holding live fire exercises in the Strait of Hormuz, a key shipping route in the region with thousands of U.S. troops stationed nearby. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons, and with me on set is NBC News Chief Washington Correspondent and Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Monica, let's start with you. What more do we know about the role President Trump is playing in these talks in Geneva?
Yeah, he mentioned that he was going to be involved indirectly, and we know from Vice President Vance just moments ago, Ryan, that he spoke with both Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner earlier today, and the agreement and the position of the Trump administration at this time seems to be that they are still pursuing this diplomatic path, but that the president is still reserving all of his options, and that could still include those military strikes, and that's why you have seen such a buildup of assets in the region if the president decides to go that route. But we've been here before with this kind of rhetoric back and forth between Iran and the United States, with the president, remember, saying some weeks ago that the U.S. was locked and loaded and ready to go, only to back down from that to support the protesters at the height of those demonstrations, and then again to pull back from that and indicate that they were still reviewing their options. So this seems to be a moment in which the president, the vice president are saying that Iran has not recognized some red lines that the U.S. has, they say, for this potential future deal. But what hasn't been clear also, Ryan, is exactly what the goal is of any potential U.S. action in Iran. Is it the regime change? As the president said, that would be the best thing. But what would that mean for who would then lead Iran and what would happen after that? That's still an open question. Is this about the ballistic missile program, or is this about the nuclear weapon capability that has been the focus of the last couple of days? So it does seem that talks are going to continue. The president will continue to be brief, but I think you can still expect this kind of heated language and rhetoric to go back and forth.
And let's talk more about that rhetoric, because it is potentially explosive here. I mean, has the White House reacted to Iran's live fire exercises, or even some of the statements that Iranian's supreme leader has been posting on social media? He's threatening the U.S. military forces right now.
The White House will only say essentially that when the president feels he needs to act on this, he will, and that anyone who doubts that just needs to look toward the evidence of the strikes of last summer on those nuclear sites in Iran, on that Operation Midnight Hammer, as it was called. And that is something that the White House continues to come back to, saying that the president, if he decides he wants to go forward with this, will do so. He will be briefed. He will continue to see what goes into a decision like this, and then ultimately make that call. That's what the vice president also said in this interview moments ago, that it's only the president who can decide this, though we know, again, that there seemed to be a moment or a pause a couple of weeks ago where they did take one step back from the brink of this potential action that now, again, is back in the conversation in a significant way. But again, this is something we have seen go back and forth, Ryan. It's just unclear whether this time there is something indicative here of actual military action, though I think they're going to try to continue to do the diplomatic negotiation, at least in the short term. Right.
All right, let's pick up on that and go to Keir now, because Keir, they are at least talking, at least on some level. Give us the view from the region. Was enough accomplished in Geneva to avoid military escalation in the region?
No, not enough in Geneva. Now, the question is whether or not more can be achieved, as Monica was laying out there, in potential talks looking ahead. Look, we don't know when strikes might happen, if they happen. Famously, last year, the Iranians point this out, there were talks taking place when President Trump launched Operation Midnight Hammer to hit those Iranian nuclear program sites. And of course, that was during the 12-day war. So there is a lot of military hardware in this region now. I mean, it's bristling with military hardware. F-35s, F-18s, air defenses around bases. I think one of the things that has happened in the weeks that have passed is that the Trump administration was considering a strike. Many of America's allies and partners in the region, the Arab nations, and possibly the Israelis as well, were worried that they wouldn't be properly defended by a reaction from the Iranians. One of the points here is the arsenal, the missile arsenal that Iran has. And now what we've seen since then are these huge amounts of armaments. As you mentioned, those two carrier strike groups, there are unconfirmed reports of AWACS on their way here. The amount of machinery, if you like, that has been moved around now potentially puts the Trump administration in a position where the military will be able to say to the president, "You can do this now, and we can react to whatever Iran throws at us." But it will be high risk, and particularly if the decision was to strike the leadership of Iran, even potentially the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, that might put Iran in a position where it feels it has no choice but to throw everything it can back. So there certainly is a risk. Thousands of American servicemen and women are based in this region.
Yeah. And of course, Keir, this all comes after we saw those nationwide protests last month that were fueled by Iran's economic crisis. Given that, does Iran have any leverage going into these talks? Would they settle for just sanctions relief at this point?
Well, the Iranians are famous for delaying and kind of trying to get... This goes back all the way back to 1979, frankly. The Iranians are famous for trying to kind of bog Washington down in talks and stretch things out, playing for time, if you like. What we do know is that what the Iranians have said is that they are prepared to talk about the nuclear program, may be prepared to, if you like, dilute the highly enriched uranium, 400 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium, but not to send it out of the country, not to take any action immediately anyway around those missiles, not to take any action around proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, and not to do another thing that the Trump administration has been saying, as you mentioned, and that is to agree to change the way it treats its own people. So these talks today, 3 hours long, how much did they really get into in those talks of that kind of granular detail? And how is President Trump now assessing what he's being told by his envoy and his son-in-law about what the Iranians are prepared to do and they're not prepared to do?
Okay, Keir, thank you for that. Let's turn now to Andrea in studio, who just got back from Munich. You talked to a lot of American lawmakers about this situation and the U.S. stance towards Iran. Well, what did they tell you?
There's a mix of views. Most of them, it was a 31-member Senate delegation, 6 House members. There's a view that this is too risky, that the chaos that could follow could be more devastating than what is continuing right now. There's one outlier. He's got some support, and that is Lindsey Graham. And he believes that the chaos that could follow the regime being toppled is less risky than the chaos right now, than the savagery of the response to the protesters, than the arrests, the killings. And I talked to him at an enormous rally. I went with him to a rally in Munich it turned out to be 250,000 people turning out in the rain on a muddy field that is usually used for Oktoberfest. And it was organized by Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, who is one figure who is being talked about as a potential transitional figure. He doesn't have support, broad-based support, but he certainly has a lot of support within Iran and outside. There were protests all over the world. I talked to Lindsey Graham before he addressed this crowd as though it were a political rally, and this is what he said about his message.
You got two choices: continue this murderous regime, and which would be disaster for the planet, or stick with the Iranian people, give them what they need to achieve their long desire to be free. This decision will affect America for years to come, the entire world for years to come. If the Iranian people can pull this off, take the Ayatollah down, and replace him with something far better, which I think will happen, then Hezbollah, Hamas, all the terrorist groups fall. If the mothership of terrorism falls, the world's in a better spot.
Now, we talked to some of the demonstrators there. They're from all over the world, and they say, you know, the president said help is on the way. Well, where's the help? People were slaughtered. Now, does he really mean it? What Lindsey Graham told me is he's hoping that these protests, these large crowds, will inspire people to take to the streets in larger numbers inside Iran and really be a tipping point. He's also telling the president, your legacy depends on not abandoning the people of Iran. This is your opportunity. The president, I believe, firmly believes that they've got to contain the missiles. That's what the Saudis and the UAE are telling him. Lindsey Graham is in the region. He just came from Israel. He's going to be in the UAE and then to Saudi Arabia, trying to persuade the Arabs that the retaliation will be less risky to them if the U.S. takes action, takes out the launchers. So that's one of the plans. But I think the bottom line is if Iran does not agree to stop enrichment and contain their missile program, I don't think there's going to be any way out of avoiding a military clash.
Okay, Andrea Mitchell, with terrific reporting from Munich and beyond. Andrea, thank you as always. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.